Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back to science. All right, we're going to talk about organs of the female reproductive system. So there's two major types of organs. There's going to be primary and secondary um, reproductive organs with women. So the main focus is to make an egg cell, which is also called an oocyte. We'll look at oogenesis in a later section. So the process we're not focusing on, but we're going to look at the transport, the location of where things are stored, where things are ultimately made. And in the end, we want to produce a favorable environment for growing a fertilized egg, which we're going to call a zygote. We also have female sex hormones that are going to be involved in this process. So, two major reproductive organs. The primary is going to be the ovaries, also called the gonads. Gonads are a general term for reproductive. So the testes and ovaries are both gonads, and we're going to have the ovaries that we're focusing on here. This is the primary sex organ. Number two, we're going to have the accessory organs. These are going to be both internal and external reproductive organs. We'll talk about that momentarily. Let's go ahead and look at this cross-section view of the female anatomy. So we have rectum, and then we move forward, we have the vaginal canal. You can notice the ring-like lines that are within that. There are different circular rings all the way down the vaginal canal. You can also, as you move outward, you're going to have the labia minora. If you move out a little bit further, you're going to have the labia majora. All right. If you move forward towards the anterior of the body, you're going to see that here's the urinary bladder. And if you transition up to the muno, and this is the urethra that's going to be opening here. Just above the urethra, where the labia minora nearly meets, is going to be the clitoris. So the clitoris is there. If you move a little bit further, you're going to find a bone that's going to be pretty prominent. And this is going to be the pubic symphysis. We know the pubic symphysis is going to have a type of cartilage that is between it that softens during childbirth. Also, due to this position of bone, this is going to be the most anterior bump on the peritoneal region on the external anterior anatomy. All right, so if we move further into this area, we're going to get the cervix, which is the opening that's here. If you move a little bit lateral, you're going to have the fornix. This is the whole structure here is the uterus. And you can see where the uterus is located. It's essentially sitting right on top of the urinary bladder. When there's a child there, it causes this to decrease in volume. We'll talk about that then much later. All right, so vaginal canal, cervix, and here we get into the uterus. And connecting from the side of the uterus, we'll see on a different view and have a better understanding of this. But we can see the uterine tube, also called the fallopian tube. And at the very end, we have these finger-like projections that are coming down that are called fimbriae. This area of the fallopian tube is going to be called the infundibulum. We'll talk about that in a moment. And you can see the structure right here that kind of looks yellowish. This is the ovary. There are two ovaries, one on each side of the interior of the pelvis. All right. So let's talk about ovaries. Ovaries are going to have different areas of the ovary. You're going to have the external portion. You're going to have the internal portion. We'll talk about the medulla as well in a moment. All right, so the ovaries are going to be solid structures, and they're going to be anchored very securely to the interior of the pelvic wall. So if you go to the inside of the actual hip muscles, the ilium that we look there, we're going to find that the ilium and the ischium, that this area is going to have a lot of ligaments, 3 different ligaments that are going to be involved in helping hold the ovary in place. So we have the broad ligament. This is the largest ligament. It's going to hold the ovary in place, and it also attached to the uterine tubes and the uterus. So broad ligament. Notice how wide and broad it is, and you can see that it is holding. You can see this uterine tube that you see here is embedded here, but invisible. It's showing that it's holding that in place. We'll talk about if that was moved out of place and what could possibly happen with ectopic pregnancies at another time. All right, there's also a suspensory ligament. This is going to hold the ovary at the upper end. Notice that it's there, anchoring. So now we have these two major anchors. And then we have the ovarian ligament. This is going to be rounded, cord-like thickening of the broad ligament, and it's going to attach to the lower end of the uterus. Um, so we have all of these different ligaments: broad ligament, ovarian ligament, suspensory ligament, that are holding this in place. So overkill? No, it's not overkill. But let's say this: it's important that it's held here in place. The most important thing that you could protect for a species are essentially its way to reproduce successfully. If this was mobile, moving around, it would create all kinds of secondary problems that would put the health of the mother at risk. All right, we talked about the descent of the testes in males, and very much like the descent of the testes, we also have descent of the ovaries. So the ovaries are going to start out in the abdominal cavity near the kidney, and they're going to move down. And so they're going to do this as the fetus is developing. So the ovaries are going to descend to a location just inferior to the pelvic brim, where they will remain until they are attached to later pelvic wall. All right, so the ovary itself, the gonad, we have the interior part, which is going to be called the ovarian medulla. So inside, you're going to find mostly things like lymphatic, nervous, vascular tissue that's there. And so taking care of the nutrient need supply along with lymphatic. So lymphatic's going to take interstitial fluid. It's also going to be involved in finding all these different kinds of viruses and different things, and including cancers. And there's a correlation with cancer and lymphatics because this is where we're fighting most of our cancer cells is in the lymphatic system. So as we do this, it would make sense that if it metastasizes through the lymphatic system somehow, that we would end up with, let's say, if you have breast cancer, also possibility that you would have a metastasis in an ovary, even though those two things are not in close proximity to each other. All right, so the outside of the ovary, you get to the ovarian cortex. This is going to have more compact tissue. It's going to have a grainy appearance. If you notice the images that we've been looking, kind of looks like lines on it. And this is due to the masses that are there that are called ovarian follicles. So the oocytes develop inside these follicles. Did you catch that? The egg cell, the oocyte, they develop inside the follicles. That's important. So let's talk about those primary follicles. So during prenatal development, the primordial germ cells called oogonia are going to divide by mitosis into more oogonia in the female ovaries. The oogonia develop into the primary oocytes. At this point, it pretty much gets to the point of like, all right, we've made enough of these primary oocytes, and this is like fetal development. And it says we've got enough. Let's just wait. Let's just wait. And then they don't and continue more development until puberty, when you start actually ovulating those. So let me make sure that you understand how fascinating this is. The egg cells are developed while this thing is, let's say this thing, while this baby girl is developing in her mother's womb, she develops her own egg cells, which means the mother is not only carrying her daughter, but she's carrying the egg cells that will be her grandchildren. Isn't that fascinating? So, to give you kind of scale, there's going to be about 300 to 400 oocytes that are going to be released during a female's reproductive life. Many of the cells that are made are going to be broken down through a process called apoptosis. It's pre-programmed cell death. Most of them, up to 90%, are going to be lost due to this. So a woman will produce between 300 and 400 egg cells in her life. A male will produce 250 million sperm cells per ejaculation. Drastic quantity difference in the number of reproductive cells. To be fair, the egg cell, way larger than the male's reproductive cells. Matter of fact, in fertilization, just essentially the genetic component is what the male will contribute, like his 23 chromosomes. The female is going to produce the cell that everything is going to happen in. So, female internal accessory reproductive organs. All right, these are going to include the uterine tubes, uterus, and vagina. The uterine tubes are going to be called the fallopian tubes or oviducts. This is the connection from ovary to the uterus. This is the tube that is going to carry the egg cell to the uterus so it can implant there if it has been fertilized. If you're doing a comparative anatomy between male and female, males are going to have their vas deferens or ductus deferens. Females are going to have the fallopian tubes or oviducts. There's several different names for this, the uterine tubes. These are tubes that are going to be the transport highway, long tubes transporting the gametes to their destination. All right, so at the very end of the ovary is going to be an area called an infundibulum. Infundibulum is going to be the area that's right here. This is the infundibulum. It's cone-like shaped. We've said the word infundibulum before because there's an area of the brain that goes between the hypothalamus, goes down towards the pituitary gland. That area is also called an infundibulum. An infundibulum is going to be a funneling area. So this is a second infundibulum that we're talking about. So here we have the ovary. We can see ovarian ligaments that's going to be there. This is the uterus. And so we have the ovary. We have the release of this oocyte. And if you zoom in on this, you're going to find that there's actually many layers of this. This is what you call the secondary oocyte. This is the egg cell that can be fertilized. But a protective area around it include things like the zona pellucida. This area is the corona radiata. And we can also see something called a polar body, to be continued there. All right, so we have the rupturing of an egg, releasing the oocyte, this secondary oocyte that is now in this area. Fertilization occurs in this area of your uterine tube. Most people think fertilization occurs in the uterus. It does not. Fertilization occurs here. Matter of fact, if fertilization occurs this late, it won't attach the side of the uterus in a successful pregnancy. Instead, it will be shed in menses. So she will go through menstruation, shedding that potentially fertilized egg. So fertilization needs to occur only in this area, which points to there's only a short amount of time, a short range, a short window that fertilization can actually occur. It's not every day of the month. Okay, so inside of this, you have some other things. Let's talk about the inner layer as inner mucosa, middle muscularis, and also an outer covering of the peritoneum. The muscularis is going to be important in just a moment, but this is going to be essentially crowd surfing the way down because there's going to be finger-like projections, which we know are called cilia, that are going to work it down, ultimately ushering it down this way. All right, there can be peristaltic, so there's cilia that's going to be working it down, but there can be peristaltic contractions that can move it down. So peristaltic contractions are the alternation of contractions of this, let's say it's that tube where you're essentially contracting, muscle contract, this muscle contract, this muscle contract, this muscle contract, as it's working its way down to a set point, and that is to the actual uterus. So fertilization occurs here in the uterine tube. So once again, fertilization is going to occur here and work its way down. Just to review some of our anatomy, here's our suspensory ligament. You can see the vascularization innervation that's going to be there. We can see the uterine tube. We can see the ovarian ligament that's there. We can see the round ligament. And you can see the uterus and how everything is kind of embedded. That's going to be on the pelvic brim there. And you can also see here's the cervix. This is an area that is going to dilate in pregnancy whenever you're getting ready through parturition, childbirth. It's going to have dilation when they're measuring the dilation. It is the opening of the cervix that they're measuring. So this is the cervical orifice. This is the area. The cervix is completely a rounded area. This is a cutaway for you to see the entire thing, and see can also see the vaginal canal that's there with the rings that are on the inside. This is showing the cilia that are there on that outside surface. You can see them here as well in this microscopic view. And these are going to be the things that essentially are going to move it along from one area to the other. So the uterus is going to be a hollow, muscular, pear-shaped organ. And pear-shaped because it's literally pear-shaped and it's about the size of a pear. So it's a pretty good description. All right. So these are going to be attached to the pelvic walls or the broad ligament and also the round ligament. We've seen this again and again. The uterus is going to have two major regions. It's going to have the body, which is going to be the upper two-thirds. Then it's going to have the bottom third, which is going to where they're going to have opening into the vaginal canal. This is called the cervix, also called the neck. There's three different layers of the uterus. You're going to have the endometrium, that is the innermost. This is what is going to be shed each month through menstruation. You have the myometrium, that's going to be the muscular part, and it's going to be heavily used in childbirth. And also the perimetrium, which is the outside layer of this. So this is showing of the opening, the lumen. We can see the endometrium, myometrium, and perimetrium. All right, so the vagina. The vagina is going to be a fibromuscular tube that runs between the uterus and the outside of the body. It's going to convey uterine secretions, receives the penis during intercourse, and provides a passageway for offspring during birth. Surrounds end of the cervix. All right, so the fornices. These are going to be recesses between the upper vaginal wall and the cervix. So if you take a look at this area, this is referring to that area there. That's a fornice. So this is the cervix, and that area there is the fornice. All right, so the vaginal orifice, the opening to the vagina, is going to be partially enclosed by a hymen. And this is a thin layer of connective tissue, and it's made of stratified squamous epithelium. And this is something that oftentimes is broken or torn um, upon a person's first sexual experience. You can say that. But it doesn't have to be a sexual experience. It could be just a person falls and, you can land on your butt and tear this. This is a thin piece of tissue. Um, and you would be light bleeding if this is the case. And typically it does not heal back over to create a complete sheet again. Instead, it's just gone and it's no big deal. So the opening of the vagina has three different layers. It has the inner mucosal layer. This is going to be stratified squamous epithelium. Stratified because there's many layers of this. Squamous, they're very flat. These cells are shed. The environment here is quite acidic, and due to the acidity, it's going to be its own type of spermicide, preventing reproductive cells from being able to stay there long term. The acidity, because of a bacteria called acidophilus, is going to prevent most life from being able to survive there very long, which is a big part of why seminal fluid has to be um, basic or neutral to help neutralize this. And it's in the male reproductive semen, there is, we know that there's fructose as well as the male reproductive cells, those sperm cells, but also the products of the bulbar urethra, the prostate gland, and the seminal vesicles all produce this alkaline fluid that help neutralize the internal conditions, making it favorable for fertilization. So you have the inner layer, which is simple squamous epithelium, continually being replaced, a muscular layer, and an outer fibrous layer. So the external, female external reproductive organs, they're going to be surrounded openings of the urethra and the vagina. This entire area is going to be called the vulva. So the vulva includes the labia majora. This is going to be, most people don't get what the labia majora is. They call it the labia minora, the labia majora. This is going to be the rounded areas of skin that's going to be around the orifice of the vaginal tract. And so this area to the side is what we're referring to as the labia majora. With arousal, it becomes erect. Now, we're familiar with, as we study the male reproductive, and how it has the corpora cavernosa, and how it's going to have the engorgement of blood in this area because we have increased blood flow to it, reduced blood flow away from it. So it kind of inflates like a balloon would inflate, but instead it's going to do that hydrostatically with blood. This area too will get engorged with fluid, with blood, very similarly. So this is each side of the vaginal opening. So it's going to merge to form a rounded elevation over the symphysis pubis. That's going to be the mons pubis. So the bone of your hip bone, that pubic symphysis, is right in that region. So this mounded peritoneal area that has that bump, that's going to be the mons pubis. The labia majora are going to be flattened longitudinal folds between the labia majora. These are going to have a lot of blood supply going to them. And at the interior end, they form a hood-like region, which is going to be a covering around the clitoris. So we can see the clitoral hood that's there, and this is the clitoris, and this is where the labia minora is going to move up, essentially culminating there. The clitoris is going to be a small projected between the labia minora at the anterior end of the vulva. Corresponds to the male penis, um, and composed of two columns of erectile tissue. All right, so here is something that most people, I would say, are not aware of, and this is the vestibular glands. So, and just in general, the vestibule is going to be the opening where the vaginal orifice is, and so you have the labia minora, labia minora. This area between here is called the vestibule. But on the side wall of the vaginal canal, between the labia minora and the vaginal canal, are going to be the vestibular glands. There are glands there that release fluid. This releases a mucus, which is useful in sexual stimulation. All right, erection, lubrication, and orgasm. What a slide. Jeez. All right, so erectile tissue in the clitoris and around the vaginal canal entrance responds to sexual stimulation. Nitric oxide, just like it affected the male reproductive system, is going to affect the female reproductive system, dilating arteries. This is going to cause expansion of the vagina. So the vaginal orifice will decrease in size as a result of this. Lubrication. Sexual stimulation causes the vestibular glands to secrete mucus into the vestibule. The mucus will lubricate the vestibule and the vagina. These both help in the process of intercourse. All right, lastly on this, we have the orgasm. The clitoris responds to sexual stimulation. Sexual stimulation ends with orgasm, which is a pleasurable feeling of physiological and psychological release. Muscles of the perineum, uterus, uterine tubes contract rhythmically, which helps transport sperm towards the uterine tubes. So let me point this out. Orgasms help fertilization. Without an orgasm, the odds are reduced because with these muscular contractions, it helps transport the sperm to the egg cell. It's doing everything it possibly can to increase the likelihood of fertilization. So with sexual stimulation, you have the parasympathetic impulses from the sacral portion of the spinal cord. The sexual stimulation intensifies. The vestibular glands secrete mucus to lubricate. The arteries of the erectile tissue will dilate. The vagina expands and elongates. The engorged and swollen vagina increases friction between movement of the penis, and in the end, you end with an orgasm. Rhythmic contractions of muscles of the perineum, muscular walls of the uterus, and uterine tubes contract. All right, guys, this is going to end this subsection. Next time, I'll talk about oogenesis. So long.